So, the last chapter we talked about the roaring 20s and how everything was going great, things were changing quickly, and America was an exciting place. But this chapter is going to be about the Great Depression and how quickly things can change. Okay, guys, last chapter, 25, talking about the Great Depression. I'm going to go through this one a little bit quicker since it's the last one. I want to make sure you guys have enough time to get all the work done. So, when the stock market crashed, it was a big shock. People were not expecting it because things were going well for so long. The economy was going great. Only 4% of the country didn't have jobs. So that means out of 100 people, 96 of them would have had jobs. A year later, the unemployment rate has more than doubled to 9%, which is a lot higher. So what happens when these factories start slowing down? They start making less product. And since they're making less product, they have to lay off their workers. And a layoff is when they let their workers go because they can't afford to pay them anymore. Sometimes when business picks back up, you get called back to work. Sometimes it's permanent. The Ford company had to lay off 44% of its workers. So a couple years later, the unemployment rate is now 16%. 8 million Americans cannot find work, and they're using their savings accounts to try to pay for everything. Many of them are going to run out of money real soon. So, President Hoover, he was a self-made man, and he told the American people to be patient. He said, I know you guys are struggling, but things are going to get better. And that's one of the last things people want to hear if they're really struggling, to be patient. So President Hoover did not feel it was the government's responsibility to help the unemployed people. He believed that local governments, private groups, and charities should help them. He said that Americans should take responsibility for their own lives. So what Hoover's basically saying is if you are struggling, fix it. So Hoover was president for less than a year, but he catches all the blame for this. Mostly because of his attitude about not wanting to do anything to fix it. So people start naming the slums after him. So they'd have these villages that were made entirely out of like cardboard and garbage. People living in these parks where they had houses made out of just anything they could find. And those slums got the nicknames Hoovervilles. One of the things that led to the Great Depression is some of these businesses had grown too quickly and they'd made way more product than they needed. This is called overproduction. So think about it like if you had a restaurant and you sell pizza by the slice. If you make 4 pizzas and you sell all your pizzas, the next day you're going to make more pizzas. But if you double it up and you make 50 pizzas instead of 4, there's a good chance you're left with a whole bunch of leftover food. And that leftover food at the end of the night's either going to get thrown away or go to waste. So that's what happened to these factories. They had made more than they needed. And since they made more than they needed, they had to tell the workers, go home, we don't need you to make any more product. So lots of workers were laid off. Before this time, when it was good, people spent money. People spent more money than they actually had. They bought things on credit. So think about credit like how people buy a car or how people buy phones today. You got to make payments on it. If you don't make those payments, you lose those things. So lots of people could not make their payments and they lost their homes. And the banks had given so many people loans. When these banks weren't getting paid back, the banks went out of business too. Okay, so how were the farmers affected? After World War I, farmers were already struggling. They had to keep lowering their prices to get people to buy their stuff. So they got desperate and they started growing more crops than they normally would. They would plant their entire field, and that's not a good idea. Normally you have to let part of your field rest so the soil doesn't get ruined, but they had to do it to make their ends meet, to make their bills get paid. So what happens? This, in a combination with a couple of other things, causes something called the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl was this giant dust storm that lasted for weeks. And there was so much dust in the air that people couldn't see. It looked like night during the day. They oftentimes would call it like a brown blizzard because there'd be so much dust and dirt, and people would get something called dust pneumonia, where their lungs would get full of dust and dirt, and they wouldn't be able to breathe anymore. So during the Depression, a lot of people lost confidence in themselves, and since they lost confidence, they were afraid to spend any money they had. Businesses that were still open thought they might go out of business at any time. And unemployed workers, if you're looking for a job every day for weeks and weeks and weeks, eventually you're just going to quit looking because you're going to lose all hope. So these families that were struggling would stand in these things called bread lines to get free food, where they can get a loaf of bread, maybe some soup. People were really struggling, and people were unsure about how the country was going to move forward. So how were the workers affected? It didn't affect everybody equally. When the economy started to slow down, the first people to get laid off or fired were going to be the African American workers and the women. They're going to be the first ones that the factories let go. So the economy's not getting better. Hoover told people to wait, and they thought things would just get better with time, but they didn't. So Hoover says, you know what, now it's time to do something. He passed something called the Agricultural Marketing Act, and this made it so Congress would use $500 million to buy extra crops off of farmers. They hoped this would stabilize farm prices and help the farmers out. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was set up, and this loaned money to banks so the banks could open back up and avoid going out of business. Started a federal public work program to give people jobs. It was going to spend $750 million doing things like building roads, building bridges, fixing the dams. And something weird called a moratorium, where all the countries that owed us money, we told them to forget about the money they owed us, and we were hoping that that would encourage them to spend money on things. So Hoover's proposals for improving the economy were not enough, and it was too little too late. So when the next election comes up, Franklin Delano Roosevelt wins by a landslide. He promised he had a new deal for the country and he was going to act quickly. Roosevelt took an oath of office, and he basically promised people he was going to do everything he could to help the country get back on its feet. Roosevelt's New Deal plan was for the forgotten man at the bottom of the pyramid. So he was talking about helping the regular people out, and it focused on three areas: relief, recovery, and reform. So he wants to take away the pain, he wants to help people recover, and he wants to stop these kind of things from happening again. A lot of people liked Roosevelt because he was trying hard to improve things, and he was relatable. Even though he was from a wealthy family, when he was younger, he got polio, and polio is a disease which slowly makes you weaker and weaker and weaker. Initially, when he became president, he was using a cane or some crutches, but the polio is going to progress in time and take away his ability to walk. Before he became president, he said if one plan fails, he will admit it and try something else. So different than a lot of politicians today, if Roosevelt had an idea that didn't work, he wouldn't pass the blame. He would say, okay, what do we need to do now to fix it? So he gets Congress in, and he works on getting his New Deal passed. One of the parts of it is called a national bank holiday, and this makes it so there's limits on how much money you could take out of the bank at one time. And this is to stop everybody from rushing to the bank and taking all their money out because they're afraid. And this would make it harder for a bank to go out of business. They were going to loan banks money so those banks could open back up and the people could get their money out of their accounts. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration loans millions of dollars to people who are struggling. So you could go and you could tell them what kind of issues you're having, and they would give you money if they could to help you through your situation. The Civilian Conservation Corps hired young people to do work like planting trees and fixing the roads. The Agricultural Adjustment Act was set up to help farmers and pays farmers for the crops they lost. The National Recovery Administration was set up to help businesses open back up. Because if they could get a business to open back up, that business could call back the workers that it laid off. It reduced the work week. So it made it so working full-time was 40 hours. It set up a minimum wage and ended child labor. And minimum wage is an important thing. What that is that's the lowest amount they're allowed to pay you. Before this time, a boss could pay you whatever amount he wanted. Our minimum wage today is like $8, but if he knew people were desperate for money, he could lower it to $2 an hour. So minimum wage prohibits that from happening. So during the first part of the New Deal, the government focuses on giving immediate relief. They want to get the country back on their feet, and they want to get things rolling. So once they get that underway, they come up with a plan called the Second New Deal. And this focuses on making reforms. And reforms are changes. And those changes were set up to prevent this kind of catastrophe from happening again. So Congress passes a bill spending almost $5 billion to try to get these people jobs. The unemployment rate's close to 20%, and it's going to hire people to do things like build schools, hospitals, playgrounds, museums. They hire actors to do plays for free so people can have entertainment. Musicians are paid to give concerts. Artists are paid to do work like painting murals. 8 million Americans found work because of this program. And this thing was important because once people got their jobs back, they stopped feeling sorry for themselves. They got their self-respect back. They were able to take care of their families again. The Works Progress Administration helped out millions of Americans. In 1936, nearly $7 billion was spent on this program. They were fixing the roads, fixing the bridges, building schools, building hospitals, doing everything they could to make the country better and give people jobs. So before the time of the New Deal, anytime there was an argument between businesses and their workers, the federal government's usually going to side with the business owners. Things are going to change. During this time, though, the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act, gave workers the right to form unions. And a union is a group of workers who all agree to similar terms. Unions are important because they help make sure people get fair pay for their work. And basically, they make sure people get treated equally and aren't taken advantage of. One of the ways unions use to get changes done is something called collective bargaining. And that's where one person or a group of people is going to make a deal for the entire group of workers. One of the most important things that happened during this time was the Social Security Act. So the Social Security Act got passed, and it was set up to help elderly, unemployed, or disabled people, and it would help give them money to pay their bills and to make their ends meet. A lot of the suggestions for the Social Security Act were made by Frances Perkins. She was the first woman to be part of the president's cabinet, and the cabinet is the people who the president picks to help him run the country. During the Depression, a lot of Americans were in danger of losing their home, but the Homeowners Loan Corporation was set up, and it changed the way that people bought houses. It offered you a longer loan, so you would make more payments, but your payments would be much, much smaller. So instead of paying $1,000 a month for your house for 10 years, maybe you pay $350 a month for your house for 30 years. So it made it so more people could afford their house payments. So Franklin Roosevelt's doing everything he can to get our country back on its feet, and he gets elected to a second term as president. This election was important because it was the first time that many African American families had voted for a Democrat instead of a Republican. Because if you remember, Abe Lincoln was a Republican. So Roosevelt's doing everything he can to improve the country, but some people think that he's breaking the law. Many people on the Supreme Court believe that he's acting against the Constitution, which is not allowed. So they said the National Recovery Act and the Agricultural Adjustment Act were unconstitutional. So those programs had to be stopped. Well, Roosevelt gets mad because these Supreme Court judges are stopping him from trying to improve the country. So what he decides to do, every time one of those judges retires, he chooses someone much younger who is on his team to replace them. Since he stacked the court with his team, this means in the future any changes he makes, he's going to get support from. A lot of people don't like this because they think he's not playing fair. They call it court packing. Because normally the court they try to keep the court at like a balanced, 4-5. So how did the labor unions change then? The American Federation of Labor was set up, and it was normally only for skilled workers. But it's going to change to involve more people, to have more people participate in the union. Because the bigger a union is, the more powerful it is in its negotiations. One guy, John Lewis, thought that an industry-wide union was necessary. He thought including all workers would make the union stronger. Okay, so on this page, there's nothing that's covered in the worksheet, so we're going to skip this page and go to the last 2 pages, lesson 4. So the Great Depression affected many, many Americans. People were struggling, beyond belief. They couldn't pay their bills. They couldn't afford their rent. They were living without heat, living without food, living without lots of things that we see as, necessities today. So during this time, people were struggling, but they still wanted to be able to enjoy some things in life. One thing people got enjoyment out of was the movies. You could go see a movie for 5 cents back then, and it would let you forget about the struggle you got going on. A couple of famous people from the movies back then were Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. They became famous for their dancing. Shirley Temple was a famous child actress, and she became famous because no matter how bad her situations were, she was always positive in her movies. People loved comedy. There was a couple of guys called the Marx Brothers who were famous for their comedy. One of the most popular movies during this time was The Wizard of Oz, and it was one of the first movies to actually be in color. So it was a big change from the black and white people were used to. And it's a movie all about hope. So who were some of the heroes during this time? So in 1938, there was a guy named Joe Louis. So Joe Louis was the heavyweight champion of the world. And he was an American boxer. He was a black man. And what happened is he was winning tons of fights. And he took a fight against a German guy named Max Schmeling. And in that fight, Joe Louis underestimated Max Schmeling. And the German guy, Max Schmeling, beat him. So years later, about a year later, they set up a rematch. And they do a lot of stuff to hype up this fight. The German government publishes a newspaper article basically saying that Max Schmeling would not accept a rematch unless he was certain he could beat a black man in a fight. So they tried to make this into a race thing, and Max Schmeling never said those words, but they juiced this fight up and they got people excited for it. Joe Louis knew he had underestimated him the first time, so this next time he gets ready for it. 2 minutes and 4 seconds into the first round, the American Joe Louis wins and gets his title back. In 1936, over 5,000 athletes meet in Germany to participate in the Olympics. The leader of Germany is Adolf Hitler, and he had built an enormous coliseum to house these games. And he was saying that his German white athletes were the best athletes in the world. He wanted to prove that he had the superior race of humans. So one of the things that happens is Jesse Owens, an African American track athlete, destroys Hitler's hopes by winning 4 gold medals in track. In 1928, Amelia Earhart became famous for being a pilot, just like Charles Lindbergh, the guy who flew across the ocean. She is one of the first women to do multiple things in the plane. So what she wants to do is be the first woman to fly across the Atlantic Ocean. After she does that, she wants to be the first woman to fly around the world. Well, what happens is she is unsuccessful. Her plane is never found, and people aren't sure what happened to her to this day. Okay, guys, so go on to Google Classroom, knock out this last assignment. If you have any questions, we're running out of time, so let me know ASAP, and I will help you out the best I can. Stay healthy.